Thank you for listening to the show on Really Big Something Channel. April 20th, 2018.
The Kuhner Report is powered by Kelly Financial Services, cleaning up your financial bull. Get the peace of mind that you deserve at Kelly Financial Services.
This is James Brown, the Godfather of Soul. I feel good. You're checking out my man, Mike Siegel. Hit it, buddy. Hit it, buddy. Hit it, buddy.
All right, folks, here we are back at it. Good to have you with us as we move along with your calls, comments, thoughts, and reactions. If you want to respond to what Dr. Jerome Corsi had to say about the deep state trying to unseat in a coup d'etat Donald Trump, if you want to talk about the welfare reform system that needs to be reformed even further to put people back to work instead of collecting welfare when they're able-bodied with all the jobs around this country. But I also want to add something to the mix that is very troubling, but not surprising. Starbucks. I enjoy, Dunkin' Donuts has better coffee than Starbucks in my view. It's a kind of a tangy taste in the Starbucks coffee, much smoother in Dunkin' Donuts. But be that as it may, the troubling aspect, as you know, a couple of people walked into Starbucks, did not buy anything, and were just kind of loitering. Starbucks has a policy, in its written policy, that people who are loitering should be asked to leave if they're not buying anything in the store. The whole point of having Starbucks, when Howard Schultz created it, was that people could come in and envisioned at the time he started the first one in Seattle, putting people at tables where they could have conversations, have meetings, work on their computers, all of that. And it obviously turned out to be a goldmine. It was a visionary concept, and it worked. Congratulations, Mr. Schultz. But with his radical left-wing tendencies, Howard Schultz gets on the air the other day about this incident with the two fellas asked to leave and says that the person who asked them to leave had something he referred to as an unconscious bias because the two happened to be black. Now, how ludicrous is that just to make that assumption when all this person was doing was following the policy? If you're the manager, which this woman was, and you have a policy that says people cannot loiter in our stores, that's what Starbucks corporate headquarters in Seattle tells us. That's the policy they created. All she did was follow the policy. Now, these fellas are saying they were meeting somebody there to talk business, and when the other person got there, they were going to buy a drink, and I don't know the answer to that one. All the facts still have to come out. But the other reality is that there are reports that these two fellas, at least one of them, used very degraded language while they were in that store, language that was inappropriate. The police came, which was what this manager was supposed to do, to call the police if there were people there who were a problem. And then, of course, ultimately, because the police were there, they finally left. So now what's Howard Schultz doing? May 29th, he's closing down Starbucks. Don't go to Starbucks on May 29th downtown. You're not going to get there. Because they're closing the store to have sensitivity training. Are you kidding me? Guilty before you even get a trial. Howard Schultz is calling this woman basically a hidden racist because the two guys were black and she asked them to leave, even though whether they were white or black or Native American or Hispanic or Asian or from Africa itself or from Europe, wherever, that you cannot come into Starbucks and just hang out without being a paying customer. Now, talk about being found guilty before having a chance to defend yourself. It is absolutely stunning, and it just makes the point to me that he's living up to or down to his reputation as Howard Schultz about bending over backwards for the far left ideology. He didn't want to confront that, didn't want to deal with it. On top of that, there is a complaint now from a woman who herself is, I would argue, anti-Semitic because she hangs out with Louis Farrakhan and loves him. Tamika Mallory, the Women's March co-president, just a couple days ago on Tuesday, called for a boycott of Starbucks because they are partnering with the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, a mainstream Jewish civil rights group. Now, the ADL has in the past criticized Tamika Mallory and her support of Louis Farrakhan, the leader of Nation of Islam. I think anybody in their right mind would call Louis Farrakhan a despicable, heinous, reprehensible, debased anti-Semite. And for that matter, anti-white, generally. He's an absolute racist against certainly the Jewish people, calling it a gutter religion, blaming Jews for just about everything under the sun. But yet he gets on his hands and knees, and did so, being a lapdog for Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Loves Iran. Those barbaric, tyrannical, murderous dictators are people Farrakhan loves, and Tamika Mallory loves Farrakhan, so you got to figure she's of his same ilk. Now she accuses Starbucks of being reprehensible for working with the Anti-Defamation League on this sensitivity training. She went on to say, did Mallory, that Starbucks was on a decent track until they enlisted the Anti-Defamation League to build their anti-bias training. She said the ADL is constantly attacking black and brown people. Well, that's absolutely false. You know they attack because she was being attacked. They attack her because she's a venomous, hateful bigot. Is Tamika Mallory, the co-president of the Women's March. What she has said just is fuming with hatred for Jews and for white people. And so now Starbucks tries to do what's politically correct, working with the Anti-Defamation League on this sensitivity training, and they get blasted for it. But you know what? This manager at this store shouldn't have been chastised for doing what was policy of the company in the first place. So it just goes to show you Howard Schultz overrode his own policy by just making an assumption that we better protect blacks at all cost because these two fellas happen to be black. And just that fact alone puts them above the law, so to speak, in terms of the policies at Starbucks stores. That they should be allowed to stay there as non-paying customers, using the restroom, refusing to leave, saying some things reportedly that were salty, outrageous, debased language toward the woman. Then the police come, and then they finally leave, and then Howard Schultz chastises the manager of the store. 617-266-6868. It's another one of these cases where the politically correct crowd just has this double, triple, quadruple standard of how people get treated, and it's outrageous. Now, if they had been white people and committed the same exact behavior, do you think Howard Schultz would have fired the woman who was the manager who made the decision? Of course not. Somehow there's this double standard. By the way, that's the racist aspect of this. If you want to talk about Dr. King's talking about judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, he meant white, black, or any other background that one has, brown, whatever. And now you have an organization that gives preference to blacks for the same behavior. I call that racism on the part of Howard Schultz. The only thing I have in common with him is that we're both Brooklyn Jews, I guess. Both born in Brooklyn. I mean, this guy is absolutely outrageous in that behavior. Anyway, let me get your call, 617-266-6868 on the Starbucks debacle. Don't go there May 29th. They'll be closed. Rich in Lexington. Hey, Rich, you're on with Mike Siegel for Jeff Kuhner at WRKO.
17266-6868 on the Starbucks debacle.
Well, we have an echo back there for some reason. I guess he had his radio on or something. So if he wants to turn off the radio and get back on, I'm glad to do it. But we could try it again. You want to try it again? Rich, are you there? Rich, are you with us? All right, let's go to Chris next. Chris, you're on the Voice of Boston WRKO. We gave him 3 shots. He didn't make it. Hello, Chris.
Hey, how you doing today?
Good.
Pretty good, thanks. Hey, just real quick. First of all, you do stand to be corrected on one thing. They didn't leave. They were arrested. They refused to leave when the police told them to leave also.
I said that. I said when the police came in is when they were forced to leave.
No, you said they left. But
well,
anyway,
they left with the police. It's a matter of semantics, but you're correct. That's what happened.
They were arrested. But
let's put it this way: it required the police to come in and get them. How's that?
Yeah. The interesting thing about this whole thing is that, this is just typical. The left is just going to feed on themselves. You got the blacks fighting, the Jews fighting the blacks. You got the PC fighting, whoever they can. And basically, when they don't have us to beat up on or fight, they just start eating themselves. And it's just so typical. It's pathetic. That's about all I wanted to say.
I thank you for...
But I do think it's comical as you-know-what, because, it's just so typical with this little PC training that they're going to have. And a lot of companies have done things like that, but to shut 8,000 stores down for one day and lose all that revenue, I'm sure the stockholders are loving that.
Let me ask you a question, Chris. If they if 2 white guys walked in the same way and did the exact same things as these 2 fellas did, do you think Howard Schultz would be concerned about it?
Well, honestly, and everyone out there listening can call me a racist, but first of all, 2 white guys wouldn't do that. I mean, they'd follow the rules.
Let's assume they did. Howard Schultz wouldn't care one bit. He wouldn't give a damn.
No. If they did, then no, of course not. I mean, it wouldn't even have been an issue in the news. It would never have popped up on the radar. And
exactly. By the way, let me make one other point. This Tamika Mallory's going after the Anti-Defamation League. Much to my chagrin, my fellow Jews in this country voted about 60% or more for Barack Obama, who was an anti-Semite, anti-Israel guy himself. So I'm embarrassed about the Jewish people being so far left, and she's attacking people who generally support her. So, talk about being comical. Chris, appreciate the call. I thank you very much.
One comment on that?
Yeah.
I work with a lot of Jewish people. They're good friends of mine. And, not only do we work together, but we socialize and do all kinds of things outside of work. And, that's the one thing and we talk about this. And I asked them, how can you possibly vote Democrat? And I've known these people for 20-some-odd years. And, I think I don't get it. I mean, obviously, these are bright people. But when it comes to politics, they do what their parents did and what their grandparents did. And I think it's just a generational thing. And frankly, I don't understand it, to be honest with you.
That's a whole other subject, but I appreciate it and I thank you. It's an embarrassment to me, I'll tell you. I can't even talk to friends of mine who are Jewish because of their liberal nature, and they just don't want to hear it about the good things about Donald Trump. Freddie in Beverly, you're on the Voice of Boston, WRKO. Hello.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. Yeah, the double standard of the left is just incredible. There was this, maybe you've seen it, suppressed photo of Barack Obama, all smiles with Farrakhan.
Oh, I've seen it. It's been public. It's been on television, too. It's very clear. He hangs out with Farrakhan. And by the way, there are about 8 or 10 members of Congress that hang out with Farrakhan, and nobody chastises them for doing it. Everybody's afraid to say anything.
And for over 20 years, he went to a church.
Reverend Wright.
Reverend Wright spoke
another
against
anti-Semite.
But he also spoke against white people. And then you have these Facebook and things when you do have someone who's of color like Diamond and Silk who don't go with the liberal agenda. They get censored, and so it's just this amazing...
by the way, and they got censored, and Antifa has a page on Facebook. How is Antifa, which advocates violence and anarchy, getting a page from Zuckerberg, that idiot? He's a complete idiot. He's still hanging out... Mentally, he's still hanging out in his dorm room at Harvard. He doesn't get it, what he's got there.
Right.
All he did was apologize to Congress all day.
And then there was a guy trying to give a free speech lecture at a college, and he was shouted down by all the liberal college students there when he's giving a lecture on why free speech is important. It's just amazing what they can get away with.
Well, let me ask you this. One final question. I'll ask everybody. What do you think would have happened if two white people did the same thing these two fellas did at Starbucks? Would Howard Schultz be upset that she would have had them arrested and kicked out?
If she'd have taken a gun and shot the two white guys that were standing there, then he wouldn't have said anything. He would have sued them for messing up the floor with their blood.
There you go. Freddie, thank you. I appreciate it. Good to talk to you. Let's try Rich in Lexington. Rich, you're on the Voice of Boston, WRKO.
Wouldn't have said anything. He would have sued.
No, let's forget it. Let's get Rich out of there. He's just not able to fix his phone for whatever reason. Meantime, we're going to come back and continue. 617-266-6868. If you want to talk about this, the duplicity of the left on the Starbucks case, if you want to talk about what Dr. Jerome Corsi was talking about, killing the deep state, whether we should now assume that the Department of Justice and FBI conspired to try to undermine the campaign of Donald Trump, then conspired to undermine the president-elect, and now conspired to undermine the president himself. And let me ask this one question. Where is Jeff Sessions? Where is he? Why is Peter Strzok still working for the FBI? Why is Lisa Page still working there? Why is Andrew Weissman still working there? Why is Bruce Orr still working for justice? What is going on that these people are still working for these agencies when their own comments condemn them to having been virulently biased against Donald Trump and his campaign, his president-elect status, and now his presidency? How can they be fair in carrying out their duties as either investigating crimes or prosecuting crimes when, in fact, they have shown this ultimate bias? Why are they still there? I would ask Jeff Sessions that question. 617-266-6868. Good to have you with us on the Kuhner Report. Mike Siegel in at the Voice of Boston, WRKO. Back we are. Good to have you with us. Mike Siegel in at the Voice of Boston, WRKO. In for Jeff Kuhner on the Kuhner Report. Jeff's back Monday, 617-266-6868. You want to talk about Starbucks and the politically correct left-wing radical decision of Howard Schultz to decide that the manager should no longer be there, even though she carried out the policy of the store when two guys were loitering. And if you want to talk about the welfare reform needed in this country, why should 20 million people be getting welfare, food stamps, when they're able-bodied and can work, and they're not working at all? There are at least 6 million jobs across this country that are open. Let's get people to work. And as our guest said earlier, yeah, Bill Clinton signed the welfare reform bill, welfare to work, but then he put some exemptions in just before he left office that allow states to waive those requirements and still pay people welfare. What is it about the Democrats that they constantly want to have this dependency, particularly of minorities, promising them the moon, giving them nothing in order to keep them hanging around on their Democrat support? But that's going to waver because now black unemployment is at its lowest level in the history of record keeping. Same thing with Hispanic unemployment, thanks to Donald Trump. So you're going to see a lot of switching because African Americans and Hispanics are going to realize Trump is good for them. Rich on a car phone. You're on the Voice of Boston, WRKO. Hello.
Can you hear me?
I can now, sir. Yes.
All right. I'm sorry about that.
I'm glad you fixed it. Go ahead.
The Starbucks situation, I don't understand it. I mean, this is crazy. They had laws that say no loitering and you can't use the bathroom unless you're a paying customer. Now, I think we've all been out and about and had to go to the bathroom and duck into a store, and it's happened to me a couple of times where I was at. They said to me, "Oh, if you're not a paying customer, you can't use it." So I would turn around, walk out, and go somewhere else. Now, like you said about if that was two white guys that happened, nothing would have came about it. Now, I'm a big believer that there's a segment of the black population that feels like they should have a free pass because of their past, a free pass because of their past. And I think some of them try to exploit that, and they feel like they can operate and be untouchable. And I think this may be a case of that.
Well, I listen, if that's the case, then everybody has to learn a lesson. I appreciate the call. Thanks for calling back, Rich, because I'll go with Dr. King. Judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, whatever that color may be. And that's what he meant. Not preference for blacks or whites or brown-skinned people or Hispanics or whoever, but just simply based on who you are. Doesn't matter what your skin color is. That's just something that you have no control over. Gina in Saugus, you're on the Voice of Boston, WRKO. Hello, Gina.
Yes, I listen to the show all the time. When it comes to the welfare...
Thank you for Jeff. Thank you.
Okay. When it comes to the welfare, you guys have no idea how bad it is. You know how expensive it is to rent a place in Wakefield? Right there in Wakefield, they have a family where they pay Section 8 for them. You know what they do with the apartment? They're only paying $40 themselves. Okay? The state pay over $2,000 for them. They keep that place just for party. They don't even live there. They only
that's the outrageous abuse of the system. I agree with you.
You know how sick I am? It makes me so sick. I'm 59. I'm working 3 jobs, okay? And those people keep the place there empty. They only come like Christmas, holiday time to have party. They live in Lawrence because the father have a place in Lawrence. That's where they live. And the town of Wakefield paying over $2,000 a month for them. You mean to tell me why the state don't know that? Don't they have any undercover to check those people?
Well, the state of Massachusetts doesn't care, right? They just care about giving people benefits. Look, the fact is Section 8 housing is a federal program that winds up covering people's costs for housing. But there ought to be auditing to make sure that people are doing the right thing and not abusing the system as you're describing. And that number that you just described, that instance you just described, could be multiplied by thousands all over the country.
It makes me sick. Where I'm working, right? One day they have an open.
And you work 3 jobs. Thank you, Gina, for calling and sharing it. I appreciate it. Well, okay, so you work all those jobs. You're paying taxes on every one of them, and you're paying taxes to have those people have that place where they're paying next to nothing for a very nice apartment. Tell me that makes sense to anybody, especially since they're no doubt able-bodied and ought to be going to work to take care of their own rent and their own expense. We come back with Justin Danhoff of Project 21 about the New York Times and its bias. Much more coming. 2:30 at the Voice of Boston, WRKO.
WRKO, the Voice of Boston.
Back at it. Good to have you with us as we move right along. Time flies when you're having a good time. And glad to be here for Jeff, Mike Siegel in 2:35 it is. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you as we continue along with our conversation. I have a very interesting segment here. We'll get your calls at 617-266-6868. A gentleman by the name of Justin Danhoff is General Counsel for the National Center for Public Policy Research. I've talked with him in the past several times about his going to corporations, buying a few shares of stock so he could be at their annual meeting, challenging CEOs or chairmen of corporations about their policies that are leftist. I remember we talked about Starbucks, and we talked about them in the last half hour with this recent incident, but also about the fact that they seem not to want to allow people to go to work for conservative candidates even on their own time. There was a case of a guy who worked for Ted Cruz on his own time when he ran for president, and Starbucks didn't like it and didn't keep him. And so Justin Danhoff has been around. He's exposed Hillary Clinton for cutting deals when pay for play with respect to, I remember one case, General Electric in Algeria. Hillary met with Jeffrey Immelt, the head of GE, and within that same time frame, within 6 months, met with the president of Algeria, and wound up getting somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million from GE to the Clinton Foundation. And sure enough, GE got a $2.9 billion contract for a resource development for facilities to give them energy, an energy resource facility in Algeria. And so he's done a lot of great work, and he's with us today as general counsel of this organization. Mr. Danhoff, how are you? Good to talk to you.
Hey, I'm doing great, Mike. Happy Friday.
Thank you. What we have here is really quite fascinating. You went to the New York Times, talked to Sulzberger Sr. and Sulzberger Jr., the guys who run the New York Times, and really confronted them. This is about the New York Times bestseller list, which seems to exclude, whenever it can, legitimate conservative publications, even though those publications may have sold more copies than others. The conservatives do not wind up on the New York Times bestseller list. And you challenge that, and tell us about that situation.
Yeah, so I think we're on like maybe the fourth or fifth, or maybe the fifth and sixth generations of Sulzbergers running the New York Times. But hey, guess what? The New York Times is a publicly traded company, so I have a right as a shareholder to go and ask what's going on inside the corporation. And of course, for anybody whose head is not buried in the sand, the New York Times is well known as a paper that's by, of, and for leftists. But when it comes to their bestseller list, it is one of the biggest bestseller lists in the United States of America, one of the most well-known, and it really can make or break careers. And it's very interesting, in this era where we talk a lot about technology companies such as Facebook and Google and, YouTube channels and Twitter and the like, and we talk about different ways in which they have tried to limit conservative voices on their platforms. Let's also not forget the old school companies like the New York Times and their bestseller list that have done the same for decades with impunity. And so what I did is I just presented, I'm talking to, a newspaper, so I'm presenting them with a list of facts, including the fact that Jordan Peterson's book was recently blacklisted from the, from the bestseller list. This book was number one, according to Amazon, number one, according to the USA Today, number one in all book sales in the United States of America, and yet the New York Times refused to put Jordan Peterson's book on its list. Now, this seems to be a little ridiculous. Let's look at the major example. One of the biggest publishers in the United States of conservative books is a publishing house known as Regnery. Last year, Regnery had just had it. They had so many of their authors, and, guess who knows how many books are sold? Well, the publisher does. So they knew how their authors were doing as far as sales went. And time again, the New York Times was refusing to list Regnery published books on the bestseller list. So Regnery just went and they severed all ties with the New York Times bestseller list and said, look, we've had it. We've complained about this. We've brought this to your attention, and you're doing nothing about it. And so I brought it to their attention directly in front of their board of directors and the other investors. And I gave more concrete examples. And the answers I got were very interesting. First was the elder Sulzberger, Arthur, who attempted to try and explain that, we can't really tell people how our list is derived because, of course, we consider that proprietary. And, we don't count bulk sales. And he kept going, he went into the non-answer answer. And then Junior, who is now the publisher, so Arthur is the chairman of the board still, and A.G. Sulzberger, the younger, he is the publisher of the paper now. He was named so, I believe, early this year. Well, he goes into a diatribe of complete denial. There is no bias in our selection process. There is no bias, period. We've had liberals complain to us, too. Well, I'd like to know the first, last, or only time that it's been publicized that a liberal had a problem with the way the New York Times selected its bestsellers because, there doesn't appear to be any instances of this occurring, at least not publicly known. And so the way that I framed, they weren't answering my question. So the way I framed it was simple, Mike. I said, look, if what you're telling me is true, you've got a reputation of being biased against conservatives and diminishing their books or not listing them whatsoever on your bestseller list. I've got a solution. Without giving away your proprietary modeling for how you select the books, just let an independent auditor come in and evaluate the process and make sure that the political biases of the selectors have had no effect. Make sure they're simply following the process that's been laid out. And then report that to the public without telling anybody what your actual process is. And, you know, they didn't accept that either. They certainly said it was an interesting idea, but that they weren't necessarily going to do anything like that. And so that's very interesting, right? Because they do have a problem. Their problem is that it's been known that they are biased against conservatives. They are claiming that does not happen. I give them a way to prove definitively that if it's not happening, they can come out and say so with actual objective people looking at it and coming to the same conclusion. So if they want to fix the problem, I gave them a very easy solution, which leads me to believe that there is another answer here and they don't actually want to fix the problem.
Well, you know, we're talking with Justin Danhoff of the National Center for Public Policy Research. He's their general counsel, and he goes to corporate annual meetings to challenge heads of companies, as you just heard. Look, there's an indication here, Justin, because one of the executive editors at the New York Times a couple of years ago, I remember, came out with a statement that they weren't going to write anything positive about the state of Israel until there was a Palestinian state. They won't take any global warming opponents to the mainstream idea that human beings cause global warming or climate change. They won't accept, and I've interviewed hundreds of scientists over the years who say global warming or climate change are not caused by human beings. They have scientific data to prove it. New York Times won't publish that stuff. These guys go through that. They submit op-eds. They submit research that they've done. New York Times will not publish that stuff. There are two examples in other departments of the New York Times where the politically correct crowd runs that newspaper. It's not the newspaper of record anymore. It's the newspaper of propaganda. And what you're talking about with the New York Times bestseller list is another element of the pattern of behavior by the people running that newspaper, the Salzburgers and others, who do not conform to just fairly down the middle reporting. And a good example is this bestseller list at the New York Times.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a great anecdote that wasn't even related to my question that just happened to occur while I was at the meeting that really speaks to the nature. And first of all, for those who don't know, they hold their shareholder meeting in the New York Times building itself. So I was truly in the belly of the beast at this shareholder meeting.
Yeah, and there were liberals all around you, so you must have felt like it was going to be one of these, you know, you see these horror movies with rituals of witches having a sacrifice. You must have felt like, or maybe King Kong, when instead of the woman, Fay Ray, being the victim, it was Justin Danhoff at the New York Times.
Yeah, I certainly felt under intense scrutiny, but my favorite part of the meeting was when another shareholder who happened to be an employee got up and asked a question. And now she started her question by prefacing it with the fact that she's been an employee of the Times for 20 years. She didn't say in what capacity, but she's been there in that building, working there for 20 years. And she put her question to the Salzburgers like this. She said, hey, I know the paper is trying to expand outside of New York and in California specifically and in the Midwest. And I have some Democratic friends in the Midwest, specifically places like Kansas, where it's a very red, Republican state, and they are clamoring for Democratic news. So can you tell me what we're doing to get our paper in front of those people? And think about that. This is a 20-year employee of the company. The company's line is that they are objective journalists. They deny that they have this liberal bias, that they, cater to the liberal crowd in this country. And here's one of its own employees admitting truth to that lie right in the shareholder meeting. She's been there for 2 decades. She knows the room. She knows the attitudes of everyone in the room and the attitudes of the paper. And here's the best part. A.G. Salzburger gave the answer because he had done some work for the paper in the Midwest, and his answer didn't object to her characterizations at all. His answer was just about what they are going to try and do to expand the footprint of the New York Times in the Midwest, including covering things like manufacturing and agriculture that they don't necessarily cover in the New York area. And so one of the few business people that was sitting at the head table, who's the CEO, the guy who actually runs the numbers, Mark Thompson, at the very end of the answer that Sulzberger was given, he was smart enough to interject, and he goes, well, as you know, since you're an employee here, we are not a Democratic newspaper. We are objective. And, of course, she just nods her head along and says, yep, that's right. I meant to say that.
That's
it's like this lie they all tell themselves in the morning, but by lunchtime they've forgotten because, it's not true.
Well, what do we know about the New York Times erosion of its stature? I mean, I remember back a couple decades ago, and you go back to the 60s, 70s, the New York Times was the newspaper of record. There wasn't the profound line drawn in the sand between liberals and conservatives as there is today. It was a different type of politics back then. But now that the line is drawn in the sand, they've had to cross over that line to the side that they're really on, and they've been exposed. Has their influence been eroded away by work that you just did and basically bringing out the fraud of the New York Times bestseller list, among other things, or are they still the newspaper of record in your view?
Oh, that's long since gone by the wayside, and it's beyond that. It's a poor management structure. They were very, very late in the game to realize that there was a digital switch that was actually occurring. So while they obviously have the New York Times online now, that was much later than papers such as the Wall Street Journal. They were much later to understand how subscription services would work, and so their subscription based online is much less so than it probably should be if they were at the forefront of this. And so, they were behind the eight ball when it came to the explosion of the internet information age as it related to news and news consumption. And so, it's not only the fact that they are rightly perceived as liberal. It's not just that it's a perception, it's the reality. It's that they were, that their business didn't catch up with modern times either. And so they are constantly now caught in a game of catch up. And so they've had all of these, legacy costs, these printing setups that were useless at this point. And so, their business model is certainly suffering. They've gone through, a lot of board turnover in the last decade or so as a result of that. So we'll see. I mean, as I said, I'm not sure if it's the fifth or sixth generation Sulzberger to, be the new publisher, but AG just took over this year from Arthur, so we'll see. But based off of what he answered to my question, to the woman's question that I just mentioned, and other folks, I don't think that investors should have tons of confidence in the future of the New York Times if this is the direction they're going. And, especially, again, look, I'm a conservative, and conservatives complain about the bestseller list all the time. And I said, look, you could stop the complaints from people like me and others. I'm giving you solutions. And if they're not going to take solutions that are simple, then, it speaks to a more systemic problem. And why I can only guess, but why I don't think they took my solution is that all the anecdotal evidence that I provided, and that you can, just look it up online, what happened to Regnery and other publications that are conservative, all the anecdotal evidence that we have, that might just be the tip of the iceberg. So,
well, I was going to say, Justin, that a very telling point in your conversation with the Sulzbergers at the annual meeting was that they answered by saying, well, look, we had Bill O'Reilly's book at the top of the New York Times bestseller list. And I'm here to tell you, and I certainly cannot speak for him, but I'm quite confident, because I've been on his program and he's described himself this way, that he would describe himself as a populist. He isn't necessarily conservative ideologically in terms of all issues. He would not, I don't think he would accept that. That's just my perception of Bill, that he was not, in fact, a pure conservative in the way, let's say, that Sean Hannity would be, or Laura Ingraham, or
and the books they're talking about. While some of his books are political, most of Bill's books that did quite well were his killing series that weren't political at all.
They're very historical.
They were killing Lincoln, killing Reagan. These are history books. And so, sure, he might be right of center on the political spectrum, but these books are history. So to use him as an anecdote is just, further evidence that they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, he's not the pure conservative. He's more to the right, obviously, but not as much so as others. And but the New York Times will salivate over people on the far left and will protect them at all costs. There's not exposure of the left. The only one I can remember is when Hillary had the email problem. I think they broke one of the stories about that, which I would commend them for. But other than that, they're very protective of the left. You don't see it there. That's why they've lost, and that's why I asked you the question, how they've lost their credibility. We'll come right back with Justin Danhoff and the New York Times losing its place. Of course, it did own the Boston Globe for a while, now owned by John Henry, who owns the Red Sox. And the Globe has been the same way, especially under the ownership of the New York Times. Very politically correct. Good to have you with us. What are your thoughts about this? The New York Times and its left-wing ideology not publishing fairly on the New York Times bestseller list, which still has a certain level of prestige, even to this day, the legitimate value of conservative books. 617-266-6868 is the number to Boston. Good to have you with us. Isn't this just one more example of the mainstream media and its left-wing bent and its refusal to be fair? And that includes, by the way, the online social media organizations like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and all of those. Your calls are welcome for Justin Danhoff of the National Center for Public Policy Research at the Voice of Boston, WRKO. Back we are. Good to have you with us. Mike Siegel for Jeff Kuhner as we wind down. It's been great to be here for these several days, and I look forward to talking to you again. Jeff's back on Monday. Justin Danhoff is with us, the National Center for Public Policy Research. Mr. Danhoff, let me ask you this. With your conversation with the Salzburgers, what impact, if any, has there been in exposing the New York Times bestseller list and the New York Times itself as being politically correct on the left? Most, I think, recognize that, but has there been any additional feedback as a result of your conversation with the publishers of the New York Times?
Well, the one thing that was, interesting is, as I said, I had to interject and explain to them that I was giving them a solution to conservatives that complain about their paper all of the time. And so the senior Salzburger did say that, I think your idea is very interesting. We're not going to say yes or no, but that's something we should definitely discuss. And so I'm going to follow up with the Times because, again, I think this independent audit is very, very important, and it will tell us one of two things. It will tell us if anecdotally conservatives have just been wrong all along, that, when Mark Levin has his own sales numbers that his publisher gives him, and then the New York Times comes up with a completely different number that's like half the amount, well, we can now know that through an audit, Mark Levin was maybe wrong. If the New York Times is telling us the truth, maybe Mark Levin was wrong. But you know what? What we could also find is that what we know is just the tip of the iceberg. So I think it's one of the two.
All right, well, then we'll follow.
The anecdotal evidence of what we know is just a little bit of the bias that they've displayed.
We'll certainly look for that and look for more. I know you do great work in that, and I know you will follow it up. Mr. Danhoff, it's always a pleasure. I thank you for being with us. Have a great weekend, sir.
Thanks. You too, Mike. Bye-bye.
You take care. Bye-bye. Mike Siegel here in for Jeff Kuhner. I thank you very much for 3 great days. Have a great weekend. Always do be good to yourself and the world, and the world will be good to you.
The Kuhner Report is powered by Kelly Financial Services. Cleaning up your financial bull. Get the peace of mind that you deserve at Kelly Financial Services. The voice of Boston is you. 680 WRKO Boston, 100.7 WZLX HD2 Boston, an iHeart radio station.